Welcome, everybody. This is John Thackara, and these videos and interviews and discussions are my attempt to make sense about the different ways that design can contribute to regeneration at multiple scales of our cities, our places, our services, and our infrastructures. And I seek out in particular people and projects who are working at these different scales which are outside the norm of what the mainstream regards as common practice. And so it's a great pleasure to introduce you today, my guest, Harris Tiddens, who has a career in information technology and in media management, but our paths have crossed because we share an interest in trying to think in a fresh way about what is it that we mean by the word city and the relation of cities to this regeneration and transition word. And so our conversation will touch on, how can we think about this scale question in fresh ways, not abstractly, but in practical senses. And I hope that with a bit of luck, and I'm rather confident that by the end of our conversation, you'll share with me the sense that there's a lot more happening at a local level in different places around the world than one might otherwise have realized. So welcome, Harris. Thank you to meet you.
Thank you also.
Tell me, we'll come up to your other work in a minute, but I was struck by the way that you think about cities in different ways than the mainstream in terms of their relationship to public health and also the size at which we operate. Just give us a quick introduction to where our conversation has started.
Yeah, well, to make it very clear, the word city is just completely empty. It changes so much from area to area, from state to state, yet that you possibly cannot use it in a sensible way. To give you an example, in Greenland, a city is a municipality with more than 200 people. In Japan, it's a unit of more than 50,000 people, of which more than 60% are non-agricultural, etc., etc. So we have as many as definitions as we have national states. And even within these national states, for instance, Germany, it's completely, changing from area to area. To give you an example, the smallest city in Germany is the place called Arnis in the federal state of Schleswig-Holstein, with 240 people. And then you get Berlin with 3 million people. So if we talk about sustainable cities, sustainability, the parameters there are very clear. But the word city we should not use. We talk about, let's say, urban municipalities, and that makes it a bit more clear what we need to take care about.
So when people say, as they've done throughout my working life, the future will be urban, it sounds nice and neat, but actually it disguises an incredible amount of complexity. That's our starting point.
Yes, we do not, in the Middle Ages, we knew what a city was. A city was something with clear walls around it. That basically was the kernel of that urban area. And let's say, a parameter of 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers around this kernel were, so to say, the agriculture area taking care of that kernel. And that as a total was a vivid cell, which was city. In modern times, you cannot talk about a living cell much anymore. Perhaps it's more like a cancer, which is crawling out in the environment.
But then in terms of the health of the city, this is what's so intriguing to me, is that you have a world of people called public health who look at the individuals living in the city, but they don't seem to talk very much to the people who manage the city itself. So I think this is where you're coming from, is that the health of the populace and the health of the city as an entity are the same story, or certainly connected?
Yes. If we talk about urban sustainability and resilience, that should be added to that as well. We can then let's say, as a new form of organization we urgently need, then is always the question, from what experience can we learn? Now, if we look at healthcare, the notion of health is very, let's say, unclear. We have loads of parameters which describe this health. But in healthcare, the object of this care is very clear. We got a person or a family, or in epidemia, we got a large population, but it's very clear. Now, if we talk about urban sustainability and resilience, and we need to care about that. So we have an urban sustainability and resilience care. Now, we know the parameters. We got the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, which are very good set. But what are our objects? How can we learn? So that's the big question.
And the part of the problem is that in the kind of mainstream medicine, you have doctors who are basically deal with individual patients, and their business model is, 15-minute appointments or a procedure. But there don't seem to be people in urban development or managing cities with the same sort of role for the health of the city as such. They don't exist.
That certainly is a challenge. Of course, we've got loads of universities and departments doing research about urban sustainability, but that's research. But who is acting, right? So you normally you would say it could be the task of a government, it could be the task of the government of an urban municipality. But, and this is an important thing, in health, when we talk about health, is who's responsible for the health of a human being? We then in the first place say, well, that's the person itself. He only goes to a doctor when he's ill. Now, so if we talk about an urban municipality, they should be responsible for their own sustainability and resilience. So how? So what's the object again? And who is taking care? Yes.
So what's fascinating about your work, because you have a long history in China and in different parts of the world, you've seen that in different countries or regions, there is more attention and more autonomy given to small units than we might be accustomed to in Europe. Is that a fair description of what you've discovered?
Yes. Well, I did research in Beijing, in the area around Beijing, in a city called Shijiazhuang. And looking at that, it was really interesting that at the small units, which called the xiaoqu, the small areas, and let's say what we call civil parishes, which is the shechu, the community area, there was a lot of the government was really available there, and the people living there were gathered in organizations to help their community, doing good work and arranging let's say, the challenges of that specific unit in a proper way. Which is a big difference in the other two cities I did research on, which were Cologne and Hamburg, where government and democracy were not at all available in these basic civil parishes.
So in China, which is, because I observed in a very small way that there is extraordinary degree of local organization of all sorts of services and activities, is this a part of modern China, or does this go back to the prehistory before the Communist Party era in terms of how China organized itself? Is it a recent invention, or does it have long historical roots?
Well, I think in Europe as well, in China, cities, when they were small, so when they were real cities with walls around them, there was a lot of local government. What happened in Europe when these urban municipalities go bigger and bigger and bigger, then at the local units, the smaller units, there became a vacuum. In China, this has not been the case. As well in the, let's say, the hardcore communist period, these smaller units had to have all things hospital included. Now, this has been changing since the 90s a bit, but there's still a lot of governmental interest, and as well by the party. So let's say in China, about 6% of the people are member of the Communist Party. And to have, let's say, a development in the Communist Party, you need to be very active voluntarily. And if you do that well, then you can rise in the party, which is, I think we should not talk very extensively on what and at the higher levels this can mean in a one-party state. But at the basis, this is functioning quite well, I think.
So this is so fascinating to me because I remember, 20 years ago in Europe, we had this discussion of a word called subsidiarity, and there was a lot of criticism about the centralization of power in Brussels and so on. And the officials and the policymakers said, yes, we must put decision-making back down to the lowest possible level. But that hasn't really happened, has it? What is your judgment about whether this subsidiarity or back to the local, has it been real or basically just a wish or a statement?
Well, it's a description of the status quo. And they said you should not centralize from the status quo, but it is a top-down view. When we talk about subsidiarity in Europe, we do really mean that the higher unit should not do the work which the lower unit can do as well or better. But the point is, it's looking at the status quo. Now, if you look at the status quo, for instance, of a city like Cologne, which about 1 million inhabitants, then the subsidiarity stops there. But if you go down in that city, if you look at the quarter, a civil parish unit there, let's say of about 10,000, 20,000 people, then there's a vacuum. So when Europe talks about, when Brussels talks about subsidiarity, which they should do, that's a top-down view which stops at the municipality level. And that's not enough. I think we need a bottom-up subsidiarity from the point of user view.
So this is what's so fascinating to me. So I know quite a lot about some projects in places like the UK where people have launched programs to, they use the word reanimate local initiative, give people the opportunity to start a service, start a business, occupy a building. There's a group called Participatory City, another one called Civic Square, which have been wonderful and very energetic initiatives, but they've had to, it gives the impression of starting from scratch. Do you see similar phenomena in Germany, in Hamburg and Berlin, and cities that you know well? Do people have to reinvent local self-organization?
I think that's a good description. What we have seen is that in the larger cities, they were always quite centralized, which is a big difference, for instance, compared with Switzerland. In Germany, which is better than France, but in Germany, the cities are centralized and quite technocratic. So I challenge that, and I say the democracy is not working there. And there are movements going on to make that stronger, but I think that we need to do much more in this respect to mobilize the enormous potential which is not used at the moment.
What I observe, and what I'm so interested to talk to you, is that there are people who say we should organize the provision of food more locally. We should organize the care of our old people more locally, which is organizing for meeting needs. And that is one world. And then there's another world of people who kind of have arguments with the central power saying, you must give us more autonomy. Are they the same thing, or has progress been made by people appealing to the central power for more autonomy, or does it basically come from autonomously meeting your needs locally anyway?
I think the last one. At the moment, so when I talk about that now in Germany, there has not been a movement from the existing governments to decentralize. And now, for instance, to give you a fact, what it means, just to have an idea about it, the percentage of people, of the entire population of the city-state of Hamburg, that is a member of one of the 6 political parties that is at the higher level unit of there, which is called Bürgerschaft, Citizen Council. So the number of people in percentage that is a member of one of the 6 parties that are acting at the Bürgerschaft, the Citizen Council, 1.3%, which is absurd small. We cannot describe that as an effective democracy, which is wrong. And this is a big difference, for instance, with a country like Switzerland, where the municipalities have much more power and democracy is much more integrated in society. And not from, let's say, abstract political points of views. That's a waste in Germany. I give you an example. 50 kilometers at the northwest of Hamburg, there's a town called Glückstadt, which means lucky town. It's built by Danish people in history and also by Dutch. So I feel a bit at home there because it has a canal in the middle of the small town. It's alongside the Elbe. And this town has 11,000 people living there. It has a town hall. It has a mayor. It has a council of 23 people. It has more than 60 people personnel. It has a website where it's described what all these people are doing. I can even find a household plan there with more than 600 pages where exactly is described what is planned, what is done, etc., etc. Now, then you come 50 kilometers in eastern direction and you land in a civil parish of Rissen, which is a civil parish of Hamburg, with 15,500 people. And what do we find there? We find one policeman, which is located there, have his own office, and a part-time, let's say, manager for the fugitives, which are more there, but with 30 square meters of office, and that's it.
So in other words, municipalities, you can't just say, let's let the municipalities be the focus of our work, because they vary to infinity about how big they are and how much activity and autonomy they have. That's what I think the lesson of that is. It's case by case. Each place is unique. Therefore, it's probably not very productive to look for some global theory of municipal regeneration, because there is nothing global about it.
Right. So all the cities everywhere, if you look top down, all these urban municipalities are differing very much. But if you look at bottom up from the citizen point of view, then you have layer 1 units. When they are independent, they're villages, it's about half of the population is living there. And if they're embedded in a larger, let's say, urban texture, then we call them neighborhoods. That's layer 1 units, about 500 people large. You can walk there within, let's say, 5 minutes, and you can reach all the people there, playing grounds, and what you have. Layer 2 are then, when they're in units of about, let's say, 10,000, maximum of 20,000 people. When they're independent, they're small towns. And when they're embedded, we can call them civil parishes, quarters, etc. The numbers of names for these units are very large. But important is these units have very basic, should have very basic functions, like schools, like working places, healthcare. You must be able to buy things there. You must have fun, so there must be culture. And I add to that, we should also have democratic institutions there.
But what's so fascinating is that we're hearing you talk about things should be 5 minutes away. Some of the more radical changes that seem to be happening actually in the big cities and not in the small ones. For example, Paris is taking rather seriously this notion of a 15-minute city as a planning guideline. I think Stockholm is doing something similar as well. And there's something about bigger cities having the power to override vested interests like cars or, I don't know, motorway builders. Is that your judgment that some of the big cities can still be radically, have a radical agenda, even if they're big and unwieldy in other respects?
Well, I think that the larger municipalities are getting more and more aware of the fact that that they are far from an equilibrium. So they need to react to become that they fall apart and to still, let's say, be a vivid system. Now, if you look at the idea of a 15-minute, polycentric 15-minute city, that again means the 6 basic functions as is described in Paris, which is living, working, let's say, buying things, thank you, provisioning, education, healthcare, and culture. But, and this is very important, we should have there competencies for the people as well. These units are 10,000, 20,000 people large. And if they do not have competencies, then they will not have a feeling of have an efficacy of what they do. And because they think, oh, it doesn't matter, then they don't do anything at all. So they don't feel responsible for the area, which is disastrous, because the challenges that we have becoming sustainable, certainly and resilient, certainly in Europe, is to 95% the existing environment. So we must enable people there to start taking up responsibility. And that's only possible when they get competencies. So I add to the 6 basic functions which are described in Paris, there's a 7th function which must be added, and that's to have democratic institutions on the spot. So
we'll come to that in a minute, but I heard you just using this word of meeting basic needs. One of the fascinating things to me is about the certain things like local brewery or local bakery seem to be cropping up everywhere as very practical examples, bread and beer. And apparently in the past, many sort of urban situations had a bakery and a brew house on every corner or every neighborhood. So that doesn't per se require lots of strategy. If we then, maybe the job of government is to allow these people to do their craft brewery or allow them to open a bakery rather than having a plan for it. Is that how you see what this, how the enterprise grows?
Well, it's a view from both sides. The challenge to become sustainable and resilient is so large that we do not know what is working and what not. Mm. Now, if we have large organizations that trying to say what the smaller units should do, then we have a problem, because they will not start experimenting. So the small units need to have ideas to develop, for instance, to get a connection with the agriculture, let's say within a range of about 50 kilometers, so that they really can do seasonal and local, have a seasonal and local food supply. This, of course, can be organized by the smaller units themselves, and they should do that. But they will do that more easily when they feel more responsible. So it must come from both sides.
One of the fascinating things you mentioned to me was the fact that in Germany, at least, the construction industry seems to be getting with the message, whatever that is, in the sense that the big conference called Bauwelt made the 15-minute city its theme. I mean, could you say a bit more about that? Because the construction industry is like the world center for building on new empty sites. So if that world is beginning to change as well, it's an indication that change is more profound than maybe visible.
Well, the notion of the 15 minutes quarter or the polycentric city is really spreading. So there's a very fertile soil for that, obviously. The Congress, which was for, let's say, a month ago in Berlin, a 2 days Congress on this topic, was fascinating. It described attempts in Brussels, in Berlin, in Milan, worldwide, where they are all experimenting in this area. And what was also very much, let's say, encouraging is the notion that they see we need to adapt the environment, the existing environment, and not, which was a lot of in the building industry, that they talk about new buildings, which is not the challenge. They can be very interesting, but it's, let's say, 5% of the challenge.
And I was reading literally today about a report that in China, the steel industry has been told almost to stop making steel. They've been ramping up production over the last 20 years in the expectation of building more and more cities. But that's come to a rather dramatic halt, not just because of COVID and the crisis, but because there's a change of the environment to what you're saying. We have to focus on what's already there. And at the end of the day, excuse me, we don't need to build large structures if we're going to improve the quality and decentralize of cities that already exist.
Well, exactly. This was one of the reasons why I started my research, was the confrontation in China with large building areas of flats, et cetera, being empty, which was absurd waste of resources. And so, of course, China is reacting. The higher layers of government in China are very intelligent, but the organizational self-movement is huge, and to give that a change of direction is difficult. So this is why I think we have a huge chance in Europe, if we think back to our roots, where all these, in the Middle Ages, we still had cities. But if you look at that time, then all these cities were different. They had different money systems. They had different cultures, different way of approaching trade and economy, et cetera, et cetera. And this versatility and creativity is something we need to get back. And this would be, for Europe, a big chance against China. China is a monolithic system. The Chinese government does know that, and they define certain areas as areas to experiment, which they do then with real power. But the versatility that we have in Europe at the moment is not used powerful enough. We can improve that much more.
But this is why I asked you a bit earlier about to what extent this kind of degree of local self-organization in China is a modern feature, or has something in their history that they can draw on and reinvent in some way. Because that also, their cities didn't come out of thin air. They were built and expanded very quickly, but there were roots and social and cultural, in your language, roots still there. So what do you see that's part of the development process now, looking back to historical examples?
As I said in the beginning, I think the Chinese cities are different from in the, let's say, Middle Ages were a bit different. The Chinese cities were much more military based than most of the European cities, and they were strictly defined. Let's say the market area is there. The production areas there, so they were a bit structured a bit harder. But again, also in the Middle Ages, it was differing very much from city to city. The uniform structures have only evolved, let's say, in the last 100 years when things were coming into modern economy. So I think one of the things that is dictating the uniformity is money. The money system, but that's there we come in also in area of design, right? I think that at the moment the euro, which is let's say a uniform layer upon Europe, which is making very large organizations, giving them very large powers. And I think that's a danger, and this is certainly happening in China. If you look at the supermarket structure, which is exploding, one of these is exploding and being in all the smaller units, and that's dangerous because if that's a mistake, then the mistake is huge.
The argument or the evidence against that is the extent to which in the past, in our sort of histories, in Europe, China, I don't know, of course, but in Europe, we had this diversity amongst individual cities, but they also managed to find ways to collaborate. So like the Hanseatic League, for example. So there were ways in which they could collaborate, even though being very different from each other. Are there lessons from those forms of collaboration that we can revisit today? Because a lot of people in my world of design are deeply suspicious of going back to when everything was small and tiny and very unconnected. So I think it's possible to be diverse and connected, and maybe we learned that in the past. What would your observations be on that?
It's exactly the same. We cannot go back in history. The challenge is the status quo that we have, but we can learn these basic units: layer 1, neighborhoods and villages; layer 2, small cities and civil parishes. They can learn from each other, and they can respect each other, respect that they're different, and they should be, let's say, interested in looking at this diverse biosphere of all these different units and see how people solve problems there. And that's, I think, I'm sure that this is the real power of Europe, to have versatility and creativity. But horizontally, to connect them is extremely interesting. At the moment, Kate Raworth and the Doughnut Economy are setting up such ways to, let's say, help these units to do the complex thinking which is needed at the moment of what they call the 4 lenses. That's local and social, local and ecology, global and social, and global ecology. So these are the 4 lenses. And it's difficult to have that view. And Kate Raworth is, with Doughnut Economy, is just offering that in a very transparent, usable way. And so if people use that and make solutions out of that approach, where the think tank of the Doughnut Economy is delivering good processes of doing such workshops, then you can produce versatility while using the same instrument. So that is a cooperation, as you just described, was done by Hanse. Of course, Amsterdam was never in the Hanse and was always competing against it, right? So there must be, also in that area, there must be versatility.
But the donut, I know that a lot of people find the donut a very evocative and powerful way of describing the potential of a place. And what I like about it is the extent to which they look at the non-financial aspects of a local economy as well as the paid bit, because you mentioned a while ago that money is one of these globalizing systems, particularly things like the euro. But if you look at care, for example, and you talk about care for cities or care for each other or care for the land or care for the soil, a huge amount of care work is not paid particularly. It's what people do to kind of keep their communities healthy and always have done. And so my doubt about the donut economy is that a lot of economists, mainstream, jumped onto it and said, we have a new planning tool that'll work at a local level. But I think for me, it comes to life when you have the care outside the money system alongside the kind of money bits of it.
I agree on that. For me, the central, let's say, words in for my work is that to live is to care for life. This is the central thing which is, let's say, pushing me. So the economy is not a target in its own, which is, of course, Keynes and Hayek have always described the economy as a target on its own. I think that's absolutely wrong. The economy has a caring function, and what so if we talk about the doughnut economy, we must bear that in mind, that we do not approach that as a, let's say, another way of neoliberal thinking. No, economy has the task of an economy is caring.
I think this is very powerful. Maybe we can draw our conversation to a close, because I think a lot of people have been trained or just bullied into thinking that economy is money and that the purpose of the economy is to grow and the purpose of the growth is to have more money going through the system. But when you describe it as living is about caring for life, I think a large number of people, I know lots of different studies in different disciplines, kind of demonstrate that sharing resources, the caring for place, the caring for our community, that sharing responsibility for elders and young people is not something we have to reinvent. It's been there all along, but it's been kind of squeezed out by just a small number of generations of money economy. So do you think that in your research and your studies, do you see signs of this proposition that is about caring for life? Is it hard for you to sell that idea to the people you work with and discuss in your research?
Not at all. I think the one thing, but let's say I had to learn that from myself. I was, let's say, approaching the challenge that we have from an intellectual point of view. But now I know, and this is also confirmed by the doughnut economy approach, that to challenge this at the small units where you can build community, it must be fun. Yeah, it must be a joy to do that. And the thing which is so interesting, that if you look at a neighborhood, a 5-minute unit, or if you look at a civil parish, a 15-minute unit, these are so near. You are the proximity is so good at that level that you really, by having mutual projects, you build and reinforce communities, and that's fun. And that's basically, for us human beings, again, like being, let's say, the naked ape sitting on a rock and having fun, right?
I think so. And I'm going to draw it to a close for now, but I mean, it's just been a pleasure to be somebody else who looks around the edges and finds so many examples of positive development, some of which go back a long way, others are completely new. And I want to thank you for your work, Hans, and thank you for joining me today. In the description underneath the video, you will see references to Hans's work and where to find out more to the doughnut economy and other things we've talked about. But yeah, thank you for joining me, And
thank you,
good
John.
luck
It
with
was
your
a
work.
pleasure. Okay, thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you.